Okay, so I thought I'd try to put all my thoughts about amalgams and mercury into one place, so I thought I'd make this really quick video, lecture, whatever you want to call it. And we all know this is the problem that we face with the lay public and the press, that they tell half-truths, that, of course, a silver filling, amalgam filling, is 50% mercury, which we know is only partially true, because once the mercury mixes and the setting reaction occurs, there's no free mercury available. After the reaction, we have a solid product, and we all know what the reaction is. It doesn't matter if it's high copper or low copper alloys. And we know that no mercury can be released at this point. So when we look at the image on our right, we can see the crystal matrix formation that's formed by the components of powder and liquid mercury. It's a solid. Now, one of the problems is that mercury is not mercury is not mercury. There's several different forms of mercury: elemental mercury, organic and inorganic mercury. And we need to really understand how mercury and what types of mercury accumulate in the food chain and ultimately in our body. But what's really important to understand that methyl mercury is much more toxic than mercury vapor. Now, here's the problem. We've all seen this video.
What about the last time you went to the dentist and they drilled on your tooth? Here is the mercury vapor every time you raise the temperature to 110 degrees with hot coffee or...
So I want you to think about what you just saw, the vapor rising from the tooth, and that yes, there are studies that have shown that we can get mercury to be released from a tooth when grinding is introduced. But I want you to hold that thought for just a moment. So, we know that physically that the mercury rising from a tooth is a little bit difficult because mercury's high molecular weight. It's so much heavier than water and air. So when we look at something that rises like that, it probably is water vapor. Now, one of the interesting things is mercury uptake, or rather amalgam uptake, dangerous to our health? Now, only in a foreign country could something like this be done. So what they took are some volunteers, and these volunteers happened to be pre-doc dental students. They took baseline blood levels, then they pulverized some freshly mixed amalgam, and they packed 1 gram into gelatin capsules and made these poor students swallow them. And then they drew blood samples at various times for the first few hours and then for 90 days. And what they found is that over time that the half-life of the mercury in the body was about 37 days, and there was no difference between 0 and 90 days. So even a large ingestion of mercury from an amalgam filling, supposedly, that any mercury that was there is gone after 90 days. What's interesting is if you look at the EPA, they tell us that, zero point 0.1 milligrams of mercury per kilogram of body weight is considered safe. So if a normal human being, adult human being, were to eat a 6-ounce can of tuna, that's about 3 times the safe amount of mercury that's allowed per day, yet we see no uprising against bumblebee, solid white albacore, or Charlie tuna. Interesting, when Norway eliminated mercury, not amalgam fillings, but mercury from their environment, there was kind of some interesting premises at play. They stated in 2003 that there was inadequate evidence to establish that mercury in amalgam fillings leads to health effects other than possibly allergic reactions. But, to be careful that there could be some possibility. So it's a good that it's being phased out. But interestingly enough, just a year later, that after reviewing scientific studies, they concluded there was little evidence to support a causal relationship between mercury fillings and human health problems. MS. You go to the MS website, okay? They state there's no scientific evidence that mercury is responsible for the onset or worsening of MS. The Alzheimer's, their organization webpage, same thing. There is no relationship. ALS, exactly the same thing, that mercury fillings or silver fillings are not associated with ALS. Now, it's very interesting when you look at some studies, when you really try to have some controls in place. They took a case where they randomized amalgam and composite placement in children, and then they followed up body height, weight, and body fat percentage. They're looking for any differences. And they found no significant differences in physical development over 5 years in boys or girls treated with either composite or amalgams. Now, one of the things that we have to really, try to concern ourselves is, why do we select these materials? How good are they? So in another study, randomized clinical trial, the highest level of evidence we can have with an N of 472 patients, they randomly assign half to receive amalgams and the other half to receive resin-based composites. And they found that the survival rate of amalgams was actually better than composites. And when they looked at the failure rates, they concluded that the risk of secondary caries was 3.5 times greater in the composite group. Again, randomized clinical trial. One of the things we have to really be aware of, and certainly I am because of my age, I'm 60, and my patient base is aging, and with aging comes a whole bunch of consequences in the oral health. Between medications, dry mouth, inability, loss of dexterity, inability to clean, caries becomes more and more prevalent. Even worse is the onset of mental issues where patients cannot sit through procedures, consent to procedures, and things become very difficult to do comprehensive care. And fortunately, a material like amalgam allows us to address issues like these where they can be adequately managed and treated in short, simple visits. You know, there are so many things out there that we have to be concerned about. Good old Hal Huggins, who, as we know, lost his license because of what he advocated. And it's pretty much shown that, and when you look at all these pieces of information, and sorry they clicked up out of order, but that hair analysis is just fraudulent. And I'm kind of a pragmatic guy. The greatest source of mercury in our environment is released from volcanoes. So I would think it would be very simple to find, a database of health issues associated with populations around erupting volcanoes. Historically, there have been several, and as recently as Mount St. Helens, and yet we see no correlations. My buddy, Dr. Oz, again, you just wonder what the general public perceives. And so this is right off his website, and we see they're going to in their little protecto box with a typodont with some amalgam fillings, and they're going to brush, and lo and behold, the mercury sensor in front shows 61 nanograms of mercury being released by just simply brushing these amalgams. Well, the problem is the simple fact is that what they're doing is they're using a Jerome mercury vapor analyzer. And the problem with the Jerome mercury vapor analyzer is one has to understand this thing is designed. It's designed for commercial measuring. It's designed to measure mercury vapor concentrations in large rooms, okay, compared, to a relatively small sample value that one would find in the mouth. So when we take into account differences in sampling volumes and flow rates, there's going to be a big problem. So what the Jerome instrument does, and Dr. Mackert went over this in great detail, is that it's going to measure the mercury vapor in room air, okay? And it's going to draw a sampling that takes 20 seconds. And in that 20 seconds, there should be a balance of what is in the air and what is inside the sensor at this time. Now, the same thing can happen to us. If we walk into a room that is filled with some sort of pollutant or particulate, we would have nothing in our lungs until we actually inhaled for a while. And once we inhaled for at least 2.5 seconds, then a balance of stasis will occur. And so it doesn't matter how much air we inhale of the particulate pollutant, it's going to be the same concentration in our lungs that's in the room. Now the problem is with the Jerome sensor is that it takes a 20-second sampling of an entire room. Now imagine if that sensor was taking a 20-second sample of the volume of our mouth, or even the small volume of that contraption that Dr. Oz was showing, that there's going to be quite a difference because the sampling time is 8 times longer, right, in the human mouth than it would be in a room. It's not equal. So when you actually look at this, the volume that is going to be 16 times higher than the concentration of the air that's actually inhaled. So what happens is when this does finally sample, that you're going to get a 16 time, a factor of 16 time incorrect reading. So when we look at how we as a profession choose to do things, when a survey was run of dentists, that interestingly enough, dentists in amalgam-free practices were, obviously going to use direct composite, right? And both groups weighed clinical decision factors and ranked and perceived complications differently. Now, this is critical. This is critical. Dentists in amalgam-free practice were less likely to consider caries rate, patient demand, and moisture control as important clinical decision factors, and were more likely to never report experiencing complications. So there seems to be an unintended bias in people who use different materials. So Gordon Christensen asked the question, has resin-based composite replaced amalgam? And of course, as he points out, there's little disagreement that amalgam serves well. And, although it's controversial, the science easily proves that there's minimal to no health hazards. And the acceptability of class 2 resin composites continues to be a question for some dentists. Well, some have concluded that amalgam is dead. But if you look back at what we just talked about on a survey, that those who do not use amalgam seem to have a different set of criteria for success and failures. But at the end of the day, and I think Gordon made this quite clear, that it would be highly desirable if some of the dentists using the alleged poisonous properties of amalgam as practice-building ploy would find a more legitimate method to increase their practice activity. And I don't want to, leave you with any other thoughts, but I think this is where we are today. If you disagree with me, flame me. If you want to get into it in greater detail, I'll be happy to engage in a dialogue. And if you want to bring the science to the table, I will happily go over it with you. Thank you.